I didn't know that night would change my life forever. When I stepped into that old campus building, all I wanted was to finish my project in peace. But what I found was far beyond what my mind could handle. It wasn't just a story to scare clueless students or some silly superstition. That legend was real, and the night I faced it left scars that will never fade. My name is Megan Parker, and I'm an engineering student at Crestwood University. I've always been practical, a skeptic driven by logic, which doesn't exactly mesh with ghost stories. When I first heard about the student who never left, I thought it was just another tale to impress freshmen. The campus is old, with Gothic-style buildings that look like they were designed to inspire such legends. I'll admit, for a while, I found it funny how some classmates avoided the oldest building after dark, but it never made sense to me. I had more important things to worry about. That night, however, I was exhausted and frustrated. I needed to finish a crucial project, and all the libraries were closed. Then I remembered the old building, perfect for anyone seeking absolute silence. People avoided it at night because of that legend, but that just meant I'd have a quiet space to focus on my work. Without a second thought, I packed my laptop and books in my backpack and headed there, ready to finally finish the project. As I walked through the empty hallways, the sound of my footsteps echoed strangely. It was as if the entire building was listening to every move I made. The corridor lights were dim, with flickering bulbs that made the atmosphere even gloomier. Despite that, the silence bothered me more than the shadows. It wasn't the calm, comforting kind of silence. It felt heavy, almost as if it were waiting for something. I tried to push these thoughts aside as I made my way to the room I had chosen to work in. When I finally found the room, I hurried in and sat at one of the old wooden desks. The air was thick with the smell of dust and aged wood, but I expected that. I turned on my laptop and prepared to dive into my work. For a few minutes, everything seemed normal. The silence continued, and soon I was immersed in the calculations and graphs I needed to complete. But even though I was focused, I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine, as if something was off. It was as if the building itself was breathing around me, and suddenly, I wasn't so sure I was truly alone. The silence was the first thing that really unnerved me. Not the kind of silence you expect in an empty building at night, but something deeper, as if the place was waiting for something to happen. Still, I stayed focused on my work. The numbers, the formulas, and the graphs were the only things that truly mattered. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something move. A shadow, quick and almost imperceptible. For a split second, my heart raced and my fingers froze over the keyboard. I quickly turned my head, but there was nothing. Just the empty room and the faint glow of the screen illuminating the space around me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just exhaustion. "It's nothing, Megan," I murmured, as if that could settle my nerves. I took a deep breath and refocused on the screen. Yet the unease remained, like a mental itch I couldn't ignore. Even though I was alone, the feeling of being watched lingered in the air, thick and impossible to shake. Minutes passed, and I forced my eyes to stay glued to my work. It was as if, somehow, concentrating on logic and rationality would drive away the growing fear. "Fear is the mind killer," a famous quote from Dune echoed in my head. I needed to stay grounded, but still, the constant shiver along my spine wouldn't go away. Every time I tried to dismiss the feeling of being watched, it came back stronger. I began to pay more attention to the space around me, to the details of the room, as if I were waiting to see something move again. Suddenly, a soft sound behind me broke the silence. It sounded like a chair being dragged, or perhaps a light object being pushed. My whole body tensed, and I froze in place. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked to the corner of the room, but I didn't see anything immediately. Just emptiness, the darkness partially illuminated by the glow of my computer. I took a deep breath, trying to find a logical explanation, but everything felt wrong. I knew something was happening, something I couldn't see, but could feel in every cell of my body. That shadow I saw earlier, that movement at the edge of my vision, wasn't an illusion. The presence was there, invisible but real. I forced myself not to give in to panic. Once again, I tried to concentrate on my work, But now there was an unsettling certainty forming within me. I was not alone in that room. The room seemed to grow heavier, as if the air around me was becoming thick, suffocating. The ceiling lights flickered occasionally, a shaky glow that made the shadows on the walls appear to move. I could no longer focus on my work, no matter how hard I tried. The invisible presence, that sense of being watched, became almost unbearable. I turned around once more, this time with more conviction, expecting to see something. But all I saw was the same empty room. Yet I knew something was wrong, very wrong. I slowly rose from my chair, as if the slightest movement might disturb whatever was there. My whole body was tense, every muscle ready to react to anything, no matter how small. I took a deep breath, trying to control the growing panic inside me. But the air felt too cold, as if the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped. My breath formed a faint mist in the air, and that made my heart race. Something was happening. Something was here. I tried to move toward the door but hesitated. Part of me still refused to believe it. After all, it was just a legend. A ghost story to scare freshmen and gullible people. I couldn't let my tired and overworked mind play tricks on me. But all the signs were there, weren't they? The temperature, the oppressive silence, the subtle noises, and the feeling of being watched. Something was here with me. I could feel it. Every step I took seemed to amplify this presence, as if it were reacting to my hesitation. The lights flickered again, this time faster, and for a brief second, the room was plunged into complete darkness. When the light returned, I felt something move right behind me. My whole body froze. I didn't dare turn around immediately. Instead, I stood there, motionless, breathing shallowly, as if any sudden movement might trigger something I wasn't prepared to face. But then, I knew I had to look. Slowly, I turned my body, fear dominating every movement, but once again, there was nothing. Nothing visible, at least. I stood there for a moment, my mind spinning in search of explanations. My thoughts were in chaos, trying to find some logic amid the growing terror. I knew it was irrational, that I should grab my things and leave as quickly as possible, but something stopped me from doing so. The sense that the building was alive, that the walls and the air around me were closing in, was overwhelming. Deep down, I knew it was too late to simply leave. The sound came suddenly, breaking the silence like thunder in the dark. A low, metallic creak, like the sound of a chair being dragged across the floor. My muscles locked up, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The chair next to my desk, which I was sure had been perfectly still, moved on its own. It wasn't a jerky motion, but a slow, calculated slide, as if being pushed by invisible hands. I felt my heart race, each beat a reminder that what was happening here was not natural. I looked at the chair with a mix of disbelief and fear. It was as if the object had a will of its own. My mind screamed that I should get out of there, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in paralyzing terror, unable to react to what my eyes were seeing. The cold around me intensified, and my breath began to form small clouds of vapor. The entire building seemed to be enveloped in a supernatural chill, the kind that seeps into your soul, not just your body. Slowly, I forced myself to take a step back. My legs were shaking, and my eyes didn't leave the chair, as if I feared that the moment I looked away, something worse would happen. But the sound didn't stop. A low, metallic noise echoed throughout the room, as if every piece of furniture was slowly moving, dragging across the floor in a deadly silence. My terror reached its peak when I realized I wasn't just hearing things. I was seeing them move. My legs finally responded, and I ran toward the door. My fingers gripped the doorknob tightly, but it wouldn't move. No matter how much I pulled or pushed, the door was locked. Suddenly, I was trapped, alone in an old building, in the middle of the night, with something that clearly didn't belong to this world. I started banging on the door, shouting for help, but the sound of my own voice seemed to be swallowed by the walls. It was as if the building itself was trying to keep me there, an easy prey for something I couldn't see. My panic grew with each passing second. My hands slipped on the doorknob as I tried to force my way out. Each knock on the door echoed back at me, a reminder of my helplessness. The cold continued to grow around me, and the feeling that there was something, or someone, deep in that room only intensified. I knew I needed to get out, but reality was turning into a nightmare I couldn't escape from. The doorknob wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I tried. The door seemed locked from the inside, as if something was preventing me from escaping. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, but nothing outside responded to my frantic screams. For a moment, I thought about breaking one of the windows, but when I looked around, I realized they were too thick, protected by iron bars that seemed to have been part of the building's structure for decades. There was no way out through them. I turned my back to the door, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of the situation. The room was darker than before, as if the shadows had thickened. I knew there was something there with me, and the sensation of being watched was unbearable. I could feel the gaze of that invisible presence, as if it were studying my movements, feeding on my fear. More and more, I was certain I wasn't dealing with something rational. This thing, whatever it was, wanted me to be afraid, and it was succeeding. My eyes scanned every corner of the room, trying to think of a way out. My instincts screamed for me to run. But where to? The only door was locked, and the windows were useless. My body trembled so much that I could barely control my hands. Every time the room creaked or the lights flickered, I felt my heart race. It was becoming hard to think clearly. The only thing left was the desperate attempt to stay calm, not to let panic consume me entirely. Suddenly, something began to move again at the back of the room. This time, it was more than just a chair. The sound was heavier, more solid. I couldn't see what was moving, but I could hear it. My eyes widened as I tried to pinpoint the source of the noise, but all I saw was darkness. Then something brushed past me, a cold breeze, as if someone had run right by my side. My heart nearly stopped. The presence was no longer just a feeling. It was real. It was there with me, and it moved with purpose. In that moment, I realized that whatever was happening in that room wasn't going to stop until I did something. I tried to move again, this time heading toward the most illuminated corner of the room, as if the light could protect me. I knew I was running out of options, and the fear of being completely at the mercy of something invisible was more than I could bear. I needed to get out of there, but every attempt to escape seemed to pull me deeper into the nightmare that had begun with a simple legend. I was cornered. Each attempt to escape seemed to draw me further into the heart of that nightmare, and now I knew there was no way out. Something was forming at the back of the room, a shadow that seemed to emerge from the darkness. It wasn't a human figure, at least not in any way I could understand. It was as if the very darkness was taking shape, molding itself into something I couldn't describe, but that my body recognized as a threat. My legs weakened, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't move. The figure was approaching slowly, invisible steps that made the air around me feel colder. I wanted to run, scream, but no sound came out. It was as if my entire body was paralyzed by terror. The shadows rippled around the presence, making the room feel even more suffocating. My chest tightened, and it became hard to breathe. With each silent step that thing took toward me, I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. I was there, trapped and powerless, at the mercy of something I couldn't even comprehend. Then I heard a low, guttural sound. It wasn't a scream or a word, but something that sounded like a moan, coming from a place far away, from a time I couldn't imagine. The presence seemed to be communicating with me in some way, as if it were trying to envelop me in its own pain. It was a sound that reverberated inside me, disturbing and disturbed, like an echo of something tragic. Suddenly, everything became clear. The legend was real. The student who never left wasn't just a horror story to impress freshmen. He was here, or at least, what was left of him. I tried to process what was happening. The nebulous figure before me was a manifestation of what had once been a student. He hadn't simply disappeared. He was trapped there, in that building, in some kind of invisible prison. The pain I felt around him wasn't just my own. It was his. And somehow, he wanted me to feel what he had felt. The realization hit me like a blow. I wasn't just a witness that night. I was part of his revenge. With trembling legs, I forced myself to take a few steps back, trying to create some distance between us. But the figure kept advancing, relentless. The cold around me intensified, and the lights began to flicker again, casting frantic shadows across the walls. It was as if the entire building was reacting to the presence of that thing, as if it were trying to expel it, but failing. I was alone with him, and I knew I couldn't run. Not anymore. When the figure got close enough that I could feel the cold air around it, my entire body froze. I could no longer move or think clearly. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into a suffocating eternity. I was face to face with something that didn't belong to this world, an entity that carried decades of pain. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if it were stealing all the air from the room, leaving me with nothing but fear. Suddenly, the figure stopped. It didn't come any closer, but it didn't move away either. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. It was a dense presence, a distorted shadow that seemed alive, and then I realized it was waiting for something only I could give. The thought hit me like a shockwave. It didn't just want to scare me. It wanted more. It wanted me to understand. And that's when it started to murmur. The words didn't make sense at first, a distant whisper that seemed out of place. But then, slowly, they became clearer, as if they were coming from a place of deep suffering. It spoke of pain, of loss and isolation, of how it was forgotten, locked in that building, never given the chance to leave. Its words were distorted, as if coming from a dry, empty throat, but the message was clear. It wanted me to know what it was like to be trapped forever, invisible, with no one to hear its lament. And I felt it. I felt its pain in every part of my body. My knees gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, unable to resist. Tears began to roll down my face, and I didn't even know why. It was as if the sadness it carried was being poured into me without asking for permission. We were connected now, trapped in the same cycle of despair. I looked at the figure before me, unable to look away, unable to fight what was happening. It was pulling me into its world, into its suffering, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Time seemed to lose meaning. I didn't know if minutes or hours passed, but the presence remained there, refusing to let me go. The pain I felt was almost physical, and more. I found myself unable to distinguish what was real from what was an illusion. All I knew was that I was with it, trapped in that building, in that endless night. I woke up to the sound of distant voices. My eyelids were heavy, as if I had been asleep for days. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I found myself sitting on the classroom floor. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, softly illuminating the place in a way that seemed impossible after the night I had just experienced. I was curled up, hugging my knees, unable to comprehend how I had gotten there. The last thing I remembered was the cold and the presence. I heard hurried footsteps behind me, and when I turned, I saw 2 campus security guards approaching. They had worried, but cautious, expressions, as if they didn't quite know what to do. One of them crouched beside me, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't respond. My voice wouldn't come out. All I could think about was what had happened, what I had seen, what I had felt. The legend wasn't just a story. It was real, and now I was part of it. "He didn't let me leave," the words slipped out before I could think. The guard looked at the other, confused. I kept mumbling, out of control, not even realizing I was speaking. "He'll never let me leave." I repeated it over and over, without understanding why, as if it was the only truth that remained. The truth that now defined my existence. They tried to help me up, but I was paralyzed, my eyes fixed on the empty space, reliving everything that had happened the night before. As they helped me to my feet and led me out of the room, one last glance at the back of the classroom showed me that the shadow, the presence, was no longer there. But I knew it was still with me. I could feel it. The cold, the chill down my spine, the sense of being watched. None of it had gone away. And deep down, I knew it never would. He had chosen me, and now I would carry that mark forever. If I had known what awaited me in that internship, I never would have accepted the offer. Sometimes, opportunities that seem too good to be true hide secrets that can destroy everything you know. At the time, I had no idea what I was about to walk into, and I accepted the job with blind enthusiasm. What seemed like the first step toward my dream career would soon turn into the worst nightmare of my life. My name is Alexis Harper, a journalism student, and like any senior about to graduate, I was eager to gain experience in the field. When the offer came to me, it felt like all my problems had been solved at once. A small private investigation company, focused on gathering information and solving confidential cases, had offered me an internship. It wasn't exactly the traditional journalism path, but I was determined to accept anything that would bring me closer to the real world of investigative reporting. The offer was straightforward. The internship would be flexible, well paid for a beginner, and give me access to tools and techniques I wouldn't have encountered elsewhere. Of course, it seemed too good to be true, but who would turn something like that down? Without hesitation, I signed the papers and started the next day. The office was small and discreet, located in the city center. It was the kind of place that would go unnoticed by anyone passing by, which made sense for the type of work they did. Everything indicated it would be a valuable experience, but I had no idea of the true nature of that place. In the first few days, everything went smoothly. I met my boss, a formal and reserved man who spoke little about what the company actually did. The team was small, which gave me a sense of being close to the operations. My early days were filled with basic tasks, like organizing files and watching tutorials on research and surveillance techniques. Everything seemed normal until the day I received my first real assignment. At first, I was excited. The mission was to follow a man who worked at a public office. It seemed like a simple task, something any detective would do as part of a typical workday. But as I started gathering information and delving into his life, something began to bother me. The details I was uncovering about him were strangely intimate. Information no one but him should have known. And that's when my gut told me something was very wrong. My first assignment seemed far too simple. I was supposed to follow a man named Daniel Caldwell, a public sector employee, and document his routine. It sounded like standard work for a private investigation firm, so I didn't suspect anything at first. I spent hours in strategic spots, watching Daniel come and go, perform his daily tasks, greet colleagues. Everything seemed normal, almost monotonous. But as the days passed, the monotony gave way to a growing unease. The instructions I received were clear: observe and report. Up to that point, I assumed it was an assignment to track some kind of administrative fraud or verify his daily habits for a curious client. However, the more I investigated, the more disturbing information surfaced. These were intimate details about his life, things that couldn't be obtained just by following someone. Private conversations he had in his home, emails sent at odd hours, even bank records. Everything was there, too easily available, as if someone already knew everything I would find. That began to trouble me. I knew an investigator's job was to dig beneath the surface, but this data was falling into my hands without effort. Who could have access to this kind of information? And more importantly, why did the company already have so many details about Daniel's life before even assigning me to the case? I tried to focus on the task, but doubt grew inside me. Something was happening behind the scenes, and I felt like I was being manipulated somehow. Day by day, my anxiety increased. I started questioning the real purpose of my internship. Why was the company so interested in this man's life? There was something very odd about the details they were asking me to report, as if it wasn't just a routine investigation. It felt like they were testing me, as though they were measuring how far I'd go to gather information. But I was determined to see it through and uncover the truth. Then, something unexpected happened. One day, while I was following Daniel to his house, I noticed a black car parked across the street. It hadn't been there before, but now its headlights followed me, as if they knew exactly who I was. That was the beginning of my real nightmare. The black car followed me for days. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe I was overreacting, imagining things because of the stress of the internship. But as I continued my investigation, I started to realize that the feeling of being watched never left me. No matter where I went, the car was always nearby, sometimes parked at a distance, other times driving slowly past when I least expected it. The discomfort grew with each passing day, and my focus on the mission began to falter. I started feeling anxious all the time, constantly looking over my shoulder whenever I walked the streets or left my house. What once seemed like a simple internship assignment was turning into something much bigger and darker. My intuition told me I was involved in something dangerous, but fear kept me from confronting the situation directly. What if I was exaggerating? Maybe it was just a random car, a driver with no connection to my work. But the feeling of being watched refused to go away. I tried to continue the mission, keeping calm and tracking Daniel, but I couldn't focus on my work anymore. My report started lacking detail, and I hesitated before sending any information to the company. More and more, I felt like I shouldn't share what I was discovering. Something was deeply wrong with the way things were unfolding. Yet every time I tried to step away from the investigation, something pulled me back. It was as if I were trapped in a web I couldn't escape. That's when I noticed something else disturbing. I wasn't the only one being watched. Daniel seemed to be aware of something too. He started acting more cautiously, as if he knew someone was following him. This only heightened my discomfort. Did he know I was tracking him? Or, worse, was the black car following him as well? By this point, the line between who was the hunter and who was the prey became increasingly blurred, and I found myself at the center of a plot that was beginning to consume me. Deep down, I knew I needed to get out. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and my sense of security was quickly unraveling. But instead of following my instinct and walking away from the mission, I stayed. The fear of seeming incompetent, of failing at my very first internship, pushed me forward, even when all the signs were telling me to run. Things got worse in a way I couldn't have predicted. The discomfort that had been just a constant feeling of being watched turned into something much more personal and terrifying. One day, as I was reviewing my notes, I received an anonymous email. At first, I thought it was just spam, something irrelevant. But when I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of me, taken from a distance. I was walking down the street, distracted, completely unaware I was being photographed. The message was clear: "You're being watched." Panic overtook me. How was this possible? Who had taken this picture and, more importantly, why? I tried to calm myself, thinking it could be some kind of cruel joke. But then more messages started coming. Photos taken from different angles, at different times. Some were clearly recent, taken that same day. I no longer had any doubt. I was being watched, and whoever it was wanted me to know. The threats began soon after. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night, distorted voices whispering sinister warnings. Get out of the investigation while you still can. You don't know what you're getting into. With each call, the fear inside me grew. I didn't know what to do, or who to trust. Was this related to my internship? Could the company be involved? Or had I stumbled into something much bigger than I could understand? The only thing I was certain of was that my life was no longer mine alone. The following days were hell. I dreaded opening my email, fearing more photos or threatening messages. Every ring of my phone made me jump. I didn't know where to turn or who to talk to. I tried confronting my boss, but he seemed as indifferent as always. When I mentioned the threats and the photos, he just shrugged, saying it was part of the job. That made me even more suspicious. Part of the job? Since when did being followed and threatened come with a simple internship? The truth was beginning to unfold before me, and I didn't like what I was seeing. My intuition had been right all along. There was something deeply wrong with the company, with the internship, and now my life was entangled in it in a way I could never have predicted. The internship I had so eagerly accepted was leading me down a path with no way back. The walls were closing in on me, and I knew something big was about to happen. The messages, the photos, the calls, all pointed to the fact that I was being hunted. I decided it was time to confront my boss for real. I couldn't ignore what was happening to me anymore. I wanted answers. I needed to understand what was behind all of this, and I was sure he knew more than he was letting on. I walked into the office, feeling the weight of paranoia intensify with every step. When I entered, he was sitting at his desk, as calm and professional as ever, as if nothing was wrong. I, on the other hand, was shaking with anger and fear. I threw some of the photos on his desk, the ones I had received by email, hoping this would finally provoke some kind of reaction. But to my shock, he only glanced at the photos with disinterest, as if they were ordinary documents. "This is part of the job, Alexis," he repeated, as if it were the answer to all my questions. My heart raced. He had known everything all along. That much was clear now. When I asked why they were watching me, His answers were vague, evasive. "You shouldn't worry about those details," he said, as if I didn't have the right to know. More and more, I felt like I had been manipulated from the start. He assured me that it was all part of the process, that I was learning, but it felt like a carefully planned trap. I had to face the truth. I was involved in something much bigger than just an internship. I left the office, still without the answers I sought, but with the certainty that I couldn't trust anyone anymore. He was involved somehow, but what scared me more was that it might not just be him. I started to realize that everyone in the office, even those who seemed so neutral and distant, could be part of the game. Every glance, every gesture seemed to hide something. And meanwhile, the sense of impending danger only grew. I knew I was being watched closely, but I still didn't know why. Desperate, I decided the only way out was to distance myself from the company, to escape this web before it was too late. However, as I planned my exit, I realized that leaving wouldn't be as simple as it seemed. The fear that something terrible would happen if I tried to leave paralyzed me. Walking away from the company now seemed as dangerous as staying. I decided that before I left, I needed to understand exactly what was going on. Maybe if I knew the reason behind all of this, I could find a way to escape. That's when I made the mistake of investigating on my own. Using a laptop I brought from home, I accessed obscure forums and private networks, trying to uncover the company's connections to the threats I was receiving. What I found was more disturbing than I could have imagined. As I navigated through the dark corners of the internet, I discovered that my personal data, photos, messages, even recordings, had been leaked in forums on the dark web. I was being exposed in ways I never thought possible. It was as if every detail of my life was for sale, available to anyone who wanted to track me down. My heart raced as I saw images of myself, taken in intimate moments, in places where I thought I was alone. I had been watched all along, and worse, I didn't know by whom. That feeling of being hunted now made perfect sense. I wasn't just an intern investigating a case. I was the real target. For weeks, I thought I had been following Daniel, investigating his life, but it had all been a facade. Somehow, they had chosen me. But why? What had I done to attract this kind of attention? My mind raced, trying to understand what the purpose of all this was. More desperate than ever, I tried to erase the evidence, delete everything I had found, but deep down, I knew it was pointless. Whoever was behind this already had all the information they needed. My attempts to cover my tracks or hide data were irrelevant. I was in a game I could never win, and the more I tried to escape, the more trapped I felt. All that was left was to wait for the next move. The realization hit me. Whatever was happening wasn't about the internship or even about Daniel. It was about me. I was at the center of a plot I couldn't fully comprehend. But one thing was certain. They were hunting me, and now they knew I was aware of it. It was one night, when I was on the brink of collapse, that everything became clear. I was at home, locked in, trying to keep the fear at bay, when I received a message on my phone. The number was unknown, but the message was clear and simple. You were the real target all along. My whole body went cold as I read those words. Suddenly, everything made sense. The internship, the investigation, the black car. It wasn't about the man I was following. It was about me. From the beginning, I had been at the center of it all, and now they were letting me know. Panic gripped me in a way I had never experienced before. I went to the windows, making sure all the curtains were closed, but it didn't matter. They already knew where I was, who I was, and what I was doing. I tried calling the police, but the words wouldn't come out. What could I even say? How could I explain all of this without sounding completely crazy? My head spun, and every sound around me seemed amplified. Fear was taking over my ability to think clearly. The cruel truth was that I had never been in control. From the start, I had been manipulated, watched, exposed. Everything they did was to lead me to this point, and now I was in their hands. There was nowhere to run. There was no one left to trust. I was alone, trapped in a plot that had been set in motion the moment I accepted that internship. I wondered who was behind all of this, but deep down, I knew the answers might never come. Each breath felt heavy, and my heart pounded uncontrollably as I tried to make sense of how I had gone from a simple internship offer to a situation that now threatened my life. I wanted to run, disappear, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They would find me no matter where I went. The danger was closing in, and I could feel it in every fiber of my being. Everything around me was falling apart. My personal life, my career dreams, my sense of security, everything was being destroyed, piece by piece. I could barely leave the house, and when I did, it felt like something terrible was about to happen at any moment. The subtle threats that had started everything now surrounded me, turning every move I made into a choice between life and death. My attempts to seek help failed miserably. Who would believe a story like mine? I was alone, and I knew it. The internship, which had seemed like the perfect opportunity, had been the beginning of something much bigger. A game I never should have played. Now, there was no way out. More and more, I realized that I was being watched, manipulated, and guided toward a fate I couldn't control. Staying or running no longer made any difference. It was as if every move I made was being calculated by someone far more powerful. My life was now in the hands of an invisible force that had decided I had no more options. I sat on the floor of my living room, hugging my knees, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. They wanted me, and somehow, they knew I was ready to give in. What started as the internship of my dreams had become the nightmare from which I would never wake. Some strange things go unnoticed until they become impossible to ignore. For me, it all began with an empty chair in the back of the classroom. At first, it didn't bother me. Plenty of students frequently skipped class, especially during the early months of college. But as the weeks passed, the chair remained empty, always in the same spot, as if it were waiting for someone. I couldn't stop staring at it. Why did no one sit there? My name is Emily Carter, and I'm a sophomore psychology student. I've always been curious, a quality that usually helps me study people's behaviors and the subtleties around me. But that chair, always vacant, started to mess with me in a strange way. It was as if the absence of someone was becoming a presence of its own. After a few weeks of watching the same scene, I couldn't hold back my curiosity any longer. I decided to ask the professor. That afternoon, after class, I waited for everyone to leave and approached his desk. "Professor, that chair in the back of the room. Why does no one ever sit there?" He looked at me with an expression that seemed to hide something. "Oh, that chair belongs to a student who rarely shows up," he said casually, as if it were no big deal. But the discomfort I felt at his response was immediate. Something in his tone left me uneasy, as if he knew more than he was willing to share. From that moment on, my relationship with the chair changed. It was no longer just a fleeting curiosity. Now, there was a shadow of mystery surrounding it. Who was this student who never showed up? Why didn't the professor seem to care? The questions multiplied in my mind, and I knew I had to find out the truth. But at the same time, a sense of unease began to settle in. Something about that chair sent chills down my spine that I couldn't explain. In the days that followed, my attention was fixed on that chair, as if any moment the absent student would appear and take their seat. But what I didn't realize was that by giving so much importance to the chair, I was drawing something closer to me, something beyond my understanding. The empty chair wasn't just a physical absence. It carried with it a mystery that began to seep into my life in ways I could never have imagined. One seemingly ordinary day, something changed. When I entered the room for class, I immediately noticed that the chair wasn't as empty as usual. There was a backpack on the seat, casually placed, as if someone had arrived before me and reserved the spot. I paused for a moment, confused. I had never seen anyone near that chair, nor had I seen who had left the backpack there. My first thought was that the absent student had finally shown up. But as the class began and no one approached the chair, the strangeness only grew. I glanced around, looking for some explanation. None of the other students seemed to notice the change, as if the presence of the backpack was invisible to them. My eyes turned to the professor, expecting some reaction, but he continued teaching as usual, indifferent to the chair that had always been vacant until now. That left me even more unsettled. How could no one seem to notice? All I could think about was that backpack. Who had left it there? Why was no one sitting in the chair? The minutes dragged on, and the sense of discomfort grew. The backpack remained still, a silent reminder that something was out of place. When class ended, I waited to see if its owner would show up, but again, no one approached the chair. The lights began to dim as the other students quickly left, leaving me alone in the room. The backpack was still there, and my curiosity was eating me alive. For a brief moment, I thought about going over and opening it to see what was inside, but something stopped me. A chill ran down my spine, as if an invisible presence was watching, waiting. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. The backpack appeared on the empty chair, and along with it, other objects began to materialize. A notebook, a pen, even a jacket on one occasion. But the mysterious student remained absent. The unease I felt transformed into a constant presence. It was as if the chair was being used by someone I never saw, but who was always there in some way. The classroom, once a place of routine and tranquility, had become a space filled with tension. My obsession with the chair grew with each passing day, and the fact that no one else seemed to notice its strange presence made it all the more disturbing. I knew something was wrong, but the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. Something unseen had invaded that space, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. The presence around the empty chair became a constant in my life. Even though I never saw the student, the spot always felt occupied in some way. Sometimes the backpack would appear before I entered the room. Other times, it would mysteriously show up while I was distracted. It was as if the owner of the chair knew the perfect moment to make their presence felt without ever being seen. Each class, my anxiety grew. I couldn't focus on the lessons, as my eyes repeatedly darted to the chair. The emptiness was palpable, but at the same time, it was filled with something invisible. As the weeks went by, the sensation of being watched intensified, not just in the classroom but at other times throughout my day as well. It was as if the absent student, or whatever was connected to the chair, was following me. I could feel the silent presence around me, a shadow I couldn't shake. On the quietest nights, when I was in my dorm room, I felt the same chills that haunted me in class, as though something was lurking in the dark corners of my room. I tried talking to some friends about the chair and the strange things that had been happening, but no one seemed to share my unease. Whenever I mentioned the backpack or the mysterious objects, people gave me odd looks or made jokes, suggesting I was overreacting or imagining things. It only made me feel more isolated. I was dealing with something no one else seemed to see, something that was slowly consuming me. Nights became even harder. Once, while returning late from the library, the presence felt stronger than ever. It was as though someone was following me at a short distance, but every time I turned around, there was nothing but shadows. My heart pounded, and I quickened my pace, but the sensation wouldn't leave me. It was like I was being hunted by something that didn't want to fully reveal itself. I started avoiding being alone, but even when I was with others, the feeling of being watched never disappeared. By now, the empty chair was much more than just a mystery. It had become a symbol of something sinister, a presence that grew around me day by day. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew I was caught in something much bigger and far more terrifying than just a chair. The invisible presence was there, silent but relentless, and I had no idea where it would take me. The feeling of being followed became unbearable. More and more, I noticed a presence at a distance, especially after classes. It was as if someone was always lurking, watching me from afar, but never revealing themselves completely. A vague figure, almost imperceptible, seemed to trail me through the college halls, keeping a safe distance but always present. At first, I thought it was paranoia, a consequence of my obsession with the empty chair. But over time, it became clear that this wasn't just in my head. One afternoon, as I was leaving the college, I knew something was wrong. The sun was setting, and the shadows stretched long across the campus. As I walked, I felt a presence behind me. I quickly turned, expecting to see someone, but the hallway was empty. My heart raced, and I quickened my pace. Still, the feeling persisted. No matter how fast I walked, something, or someone, seemed to mirror my movements. It was as if I were being hunted by an invisible shadow, always one step behind. In a moment of impulsiveness, I decided to face my fear. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, took a deep breath, and turned around, ready to confront whatever had been following me. My eyes scanned the space, but once again, there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence and the cold walls of the college. I began to question whether I was losing my grip on reality. Could this all be in my imagination? I tried to convince myself it was, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something very real and very dangerous was around me. That night, the feeling wouldn't leave me. When I arrived at my dorm room, locking the door behind me, I felt a momentary relief, but the unease didn't entirely go away. As I lay in bed, I closed my eyes, trying to calm my mind, but the presence felt closer than ever. It was as if it were just outside, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I woke up several times during the night, convinced something was in the room, but each time I opened my eyes, the space was empty. The empty chair in the classroom was just the beginning, and now that mystery was spilling over into every aspect of my life. The next day, I decided not to ignore it anymore. I had to understand what was happening, even if it meant facing my fears. But the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. In fact, it seemed to be growing stronger, as if the owner of the empty chair was getting closer, ready to take the next step. When I returned to my dorm that day, everything felt quieter than usual. The silence, which had once been comforting, now felt heavy, suffocating. I opened the door cautiously, and the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. My eyes were immediately drawn to my room. All my belongings had been rummaged through, scattered across the floor as if someone had hurriedly gone through them, searching for something. My heart pounded, and my first instinct was to run to my roommates to see if anyone had seen anything or anyone. But to my surprise, they all denied it. The roommates who shared the dorm with me claimed they hadn't seen anyone enter or leave my room. They looked at me with a mix of confusion and skepticism, as if they were questioning whether I had made the mess myself. Frustration washed over me. I knew this wasn't just an accident or carelessness. Something, or someone, had gone through my things, and the fact that no one else seemed to notice or believe me only worsened the feeling of being surrounded by an invisible force. From that moment, my paranoia intensified. Every noise, every shadow, seemed to carry the threat that something was watching me. I returned to my room and spent hours putting my things back in order, trying to ignore the constant chill running down my spine. However, as I sifted through my clothes and notebooks, I noticed that nothing was missing. It was as if someone had gone through everything on purpose, just to unsettle me, without taking anything or leaving any clues. That was more frightening than if something had been stolen. In the days that followed, I began locking up all my belongings, closing the door to my room with an almost obsessive insistence. Yet the sense that someone had access to my personal space wouldn't leave. The lights in the dorm's hallway flickered more frequently, and every time I entered or left my room, it felt like I was being watched from afar. I looked at the windows, the mirror, searching for reflections of something that shouldn't be there, but I never found anything. As much as I tried to keep calm, the paranoia was taking over. I knew I was being surrounded, but I couldn't understand by whom or why. The empty chair, the invisible presence, and now the invasion of my dorm room. All the signs were there, but I still had no idea how to connect the pieces of this mystery. But one thing was certain. Something very strange was happening, and I was no longer safe, not even in my own room. That night, I returned to my dorm feeling an unusual sense of unease. The day had been long, but something inside me told me the worst was yet to come. As I opened the door to my room, the feeling that something was out of place intensified immediately. My hands trembled as I turned on the lights, and what I saw made me freeze in place. All of my belongings were piled in the center of the room, arranged in a meticulously organized tower. My bed, books, clothes, everything. At the top of the pile, a small note awaited, like the final piece of a sick puzzle. The note was handwritten in irregular, almost childlike penmanship. My hands shook as I picked it up to read. The short, simple message made my blood run cold. "I've always been here." Those 4 words echoed in my mind, making the feeling of being watched all too real. It wasn't just a feeling. Whoever it was, this presence had been with me from the start. Every moment of unease, every shiver, there had been something there, lurking in the shadows, manipulating every detail of my life. My body reacted with immediate panic. My heart raced, and every instinct told me to run, to get out of the room as fast as I could. But my legs felt frozen in place. I looked around, trying to understand how this had happened. I had locked the door, as always. No one besides me should have had access to the room. And yet, there was the proof. Someone had been inside, touched everything I owned, and left that terrifying message. Trying to maintain some control, I called my roommates. But, as usual, they only looked at me with disbelief. One suggested that I had dreamed it or perhaps done it without realizing, while another just shrugged, saying it must have been a cruel prank. But I knew this wasn't a prank. There was no way. The fear was tangible, and that presence that had been haunting my life was now inside my room, inside the space that was supposed to be safe. The night was a torment. I stayed up late, unable to sleep, with the note lying beside my bed. Every time I closed my eyes, the words, "I've always been here," echoed in my head, reminding me that I wasn't alone. But the worst part was that the more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself this wouldn't end here. The presence was getting bolder, closer, and I knew that soon, something even more terrifying was going to happen. The next morning, I woke up determined to find answers. I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. I needed to know who the owner of the empty chair was and what was really going on with me. The college had to have some record of this mysterious student. After all, the professor had mentioned his existence. I decided to go to the administration office and investigate. Even if it seemed like an extreme step, it was the only way to try to understand what was happening around me. The chair, the presence, the note, everything was connected, and I needed answers. When I arrived at the administration office, my heart was pounding. The clerk who greeted me seemed uninterested at first, but as I mentioned the student with the empty chair, she became more serious. I asked to see the student records, explaining that there was a student who didn't attend class but always left their belongings. She nodded and began searching through the system, typing quickly as I waited anxiously. She pulled out some records, flipped through files, and after a few minutes, she frowned. "There's no record of a student like the one you're describing," she said firmly. "At least, not officially." My eyes widened. I insisted, trying to explain the situation again, but she remained firm. If this person existed, they'd be in our records, and they're not. "Are you sure this student is officially enrolled?" Her words echoed in my mind like a blow of reality. How could there be no record? The professor had mentioned him, and there were belongings on the chair. I knew he existed, or didn't he? My mind was spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. If there was no record, who was he? And more importantly, how did his belongings keep appearing in the classroom? I left the administration office even more disturbed. My reality seemed to be crumbling around me. Everything I thought I knew was dissolving into uncertainty. It was as if the world around me was pulling me into an abyss of doubt and terror. I returned to class the next day, but now everything felt different. The empty chair was still there, but what had once been just an invisible presence now felt much more sinister. The professor avoided the subject every time I tried to question him again, and my classmates, they no longer cared about my suspicions. I was alone in this search for answers. And the scariest part was the growing certainty that if I continued investigating, I wouldn't find anything but more darkness. The empty chair never left me alone after that. Now, it felt as if the very air around it was heavy, charged with a dark mystery I couldn't ignore. Even after my attempts to get answers from the college administration, I was more lost than ever. How could a student have belongings, occupy space, but not exist in the records? This question gnawed at me, but the feeling of fear and paranoia was no longer just mental. The world around me seemed distorted, every shadow stretching longer than it should, every silence thicker and more suffocating. In the days that followed, I decided I had to confront the situation once and for all. The answer was somehow tied to that chair, to that presence. I convinced myself that to discover the truth, I needed to be there, in the same space, in the same room, vulnerable and open to whatever it was. One night, I decided to stay in the classroom after the last class, once everyone had left, and I was alone with the chair and the mystery surrounding it. As the building's lights went out, darkness enveloped the room. I sat in my usual spot, staring at the empty chair, trying to stay calm as panic slowly grew inside me. Hours passed, and the silence was almost oppressive. Then I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like breathing. Goosebumps instantly covered my skin, and fear set in. Slowly, I turned my head toward the chair. There was no one there. At least, no one visible. Suddenly, something began to form around the chair. It wasn't a clear figure, but a distortion in the air, as if the space around it was being shaped by something invisible. It was a presence, a shadow without form, but full of a terrifying energy. My body froze, and my heart pounded in my chest as I watched, unable to move or scream. The truth I had been searching for was right there in front of me, but it was something my mind refused to understand. The student who never showed up wasn't a real person. Not anymore. The empty chair belonged to someone who had never left but could never fully return either. A spirit, a soul trapped between two worlds, clinging to that space, that chair, as its last connection to reality. The note, the invisible presences, the objects, all of it had been a warning, an attempt to communicate from someone forgotten by time. I felt it now, stronger than ever. The pain and despair of this unseen presence hit me with full force, and I knew that somehow, it wanted me to know this. It wanted me to see it, to understand that it was still there. My whole body trembled, and silent tears streamed down my face. It wasn't just fear that overwhelmed me, but the absolute terror of realizing that this entity would never let me go, just as it had never left the empty chair. I had been chosen to see what no one else could, to carry the weight of what had been left behind. In that moment, I knew that no matter how hard I tried to escape, the mystery of the empty chair would always stay with me. It was a dark truth, one that would follow me forever. Changes are never easy, but I was determined to make my new dorm room feel like home. When I first entered the room, everything seemed normal. It was small but cozy, with a bed, a desk, and a small window letting in the soft light of the late afternoon. However, one thing immediately caught my attention. A small, almost hidden door on the side of the room. It was locked. I walked over, curious, and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The key was missing. On that first day, I didn't think much of it. It was just a locked closet, probably a maintenance oversight, something that could easily be fixed later. However, as the days passed, my curiosity grew. What could be hidden in there? Old books from previous students? Broken furniture? Or maybe something more intriguing? My mind began to spin with theories, but they all seemed absurd. After all, it was just a locked door, right? Every day, the locked closet became a fixed point in my thoughts. It was impossible not to notice. Its presence was subtle but constant, like a secret lurking, waiting to be uncovered. Every time I looked at it, curiosity pulsed, yet something inside warned me that maybe it was better left alone. And yet, I wanted to know. I started wondering why the key was missing. Was something important inside? Or was it something someone wanted to keep hidden? One day, I decided to ask at the college's administration. They didn't seem to know anything about the locked closet and promised to send someone to fix it, but days went by and no one showed up. The door remained closed, and my curiosity grew stronger. It was becoming an obsession, and I knew that eventually I would have to find out what was inside. Still, a part of me hesitated, as if there was something wrong with wanting to know. Deep down, I knew something about that door didn't make sense. The room was mine, but the closet seemed to belong to someone else, a part of the past I wasn't meant to touch. Even so, the mystery lingered, and with each day I spent in that room, my curiosity intensified. The locked door seemed like more than just a forgotten detail. It was an enigma, and I was about to get entangled in it. The first night I heard the noises, I tried to ignore them. The dorm was old, with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to whisper with the wind. I sat on my bed, listening to the soft creaks and murmurs around me, convincing myself it was just the old building reacting to the cold night air. However, as the midnight silence deepened, the sounds coming from the direction of the locked closet became impossible to ignore. Faint noises, like something moving inside. My first thought was that maybe an animal had somehow gotten trapped in there, something that had found its way into the closet. But the more I listened, the stranger it became. It wasn't a continuous sound but intermittent, as if something was shifting or trying to move in a tight space. My senses were on high alert, and every little noise seemed amplified by the oppressive silence in the room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The following nights brought more of the same. The pattern was always the same. The dark room, the deep silence of the night, and then the subtle noises from the closet. I started sleeping with the lights on, trying to push back the growing fear that crept in every time I heard the sounds. The nights were long and filled with silent anxiety. Every creak made me pull the covers tighter, my heart racing, my breath held, waiting for the sounds to stop. But they never completely did. As the days passed, I started paying more attention during the day too. The closet, which had once been just a curiosity, was now a constant source of discomfort. It wasn't just at night that I felt watched. Even during the day, when the sunlight streamed through the window, I felt a presence around me, something observing me closely but never fully revealing itself. The locked closet seemed more alive than I could have imagined. The situation was starting to affect my sleep and my peace of mind. I knew I needed answers, but I had no idea how to get them. The key was still missing, and the noises were getting worse. I was becoming a prisoner of my own fear, and the closet, with its locked secret, seemed to be waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Whatever was hidden inside, I knew it wouldn't stay locked forever. It was on an otherwise ordinary afternoon when I came back from campus and noticed something different. When I opened the door to my room, the first thing I saw was the closet. The door, which had always been locked, was now slightly ajar. A shiver ran down my spine as I stopped in the middle of the room, staring at that narrow opening. Fear mixed with curiosity, and for a moment, all I wanted was to run. But at the same time, something inside me screamed for me to find out what was behind that door. I took a deep breath and slowly walked toward the closet. The late afternoon light softly illuminated the room, but the space behind the door seemed to swallow all the light. With a trembling hand, I touched the door, pushing it open slowly. When the door finally swung open, what I found inside left me speechless. Clothes, but they weren't mine. They were old pieces of clothing, as if they belonged to someone else, maybe a student who had lived there years ago. Beside the clothes was something even more unsettling: old photographs. Pictures of students I had never seen before. The air in the room grew heavier as I examined the contents of the closet. The photos showed unfamiliar faces, young people who had apparently lived here before me. In one of the photos, there was a girl sitting exactly on the bed where I now slept. Her smile seemed strange, as if she knew something the others in the photo didn't. Next to the photos were objects I had never seen before: scratched notebooks, a broken watch, and an old, rusted key. Everything seemed so out of place, as if the closet was preserving fragments of another life, from another time. Each discovery deepened the sense of unease. The closet, which had once seemed like just a curiosity, now felt like a portal to a forgotten and dark past. And then I realized something even more disturbing. The door was never supposed to be open. I had left it locked. There was no way anyone could have entered the room without me knowing. The only logical explanation was that, somehow, the closet had opened on its own. But that was impossible. Or was it? I closed the closet door with a trembling hand, fear coursing through me. My palms were sweaty, and my breath was shallow. I knew I should tell someone, report what I had found, but something held me back. The closet, the clothes, the photos. Everything seemed like it had been waiting for me. And now, I felt like something more was about to happen. The discovery in the closet didn't leave my mind in the days that followed. Every time I entered the room, I felt an invisible pressure, as if the space was charged with an energy I couldn't explain. However, what happened next was the breaking point. I received an anonymous message on my phone. The words, simple and direct, made the blood freeze in my veins. "I'll be back soon. Don't touch my things." Panic overtook me. The message had no sender, and the screen of my phone seemed darker than usual, as if the words carried a veiled threat. I immediately looked toward the locked closet, as if expecting something to emerge from it at any moment. My mind raced, searching for explanations. Who could have sent this message? And how did they know I had touched the closet? More importantly, who was this person who claimed they would return? Fear began to erode my sanity. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the room, which had once been a safe space, now felt like the stage for something unknown and terrifying. The message wasn't a request. It was a warning, and I couldn't shake the idea that whoever was behind those words was closer than I could imagine. I tried to block the number, but there was no way. It was as if the sender didn't exist, as if the message had come from nowhere. That night, sleep was impossible. Every little sound, every shadow, seemed to trap me in a web of fear. I knew that by opening the closet, I had unleashed something that was now beyond my control. When I closed my eyes, images of the old clothes and photos flashed through my mind. The smiling girl, sitting on the bed that was now mine, seemed to stare at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Who were these people, and why were their things still in the closet? In the days that followed, my paranoia grew. I constantly scanned the room, expecting to see something out of place. I tried to focus on my studies, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I knew something was about to happen, and the anonymous message was the prelude to something much bigger. Something that was about to reveal itself, though I couldn't fully understand it yet. And the worst part was the certainty that whoever it was would be back soon. Desperate and not knowing what else to do, I decided I needed answers. The fear that something worse could happen was eating me alive, so I went to the college's administration office. I tried to stay calm as I explained everything: the locked closet, the strange objects, the old clothes, and especially the anonymous message I had received. The clerk listened with a blank expression, as if she had heard this type of story before. When I finished, she turned to her computer and began searching the dorm records. It was a tense few minutes. My fingers tapped nervously on the table as I waited for some explanation. Maybe the closet had been locked because a former tenant had left their things behind. Maybe the student was still registered and had simply forgotten to pick up their belongings. But when the clerk stopped typing and looked up at me, I knew something was wrong. "There's no record of another student living in that room before you," she said, her voice firm and neutral. "That room has been vacant for a long time before you moved in." I was in shock. How was that possible? The clothes, the objects, the old photos, everything I had found in the closet seemed to belong to someone. But if no one was registered, then who was that person? Questions swirled in my mind in a whirlwind of confusion. I explained again what I had found in the closet, but the clerk's response didn't change. "I'm sorry, but the system is clear. There are no records." That left me more frightened than before. Something was happening, something that didn't fit with the reality I knew. I left the administration office even more confused, and now with a growing sense of dread. There was nowhere left to run. If the records were empty, then who had left those things in the closet? And more importantly, who had sent me that message? I returned to my room with an even greater sense of foreboding. Each step I took toward the door of my dorm felt like I was getting closer to something I didn't want to face. But deep down, I knew the mystery of the locked closet was far from being solved. When I entered the room, the air felt heavier and the silence deeper. The closet, as always, stood there, quiet and seemingly harmless. But now, I knew it hid much more than just old clothes and photos. It hid a truth that no one, not even the college administration, seemed to know. And that truth was getting closer, day by day. The days following my visit to the administration were the worst yet. Every time I entered the room, the feeling that something was out of place intensified. The mystery of the locked closet was constantly on my mind, but now the discomfort was tangible. At night, the subtle noises came again. Soft creaks, as if something was moving inside the closet, kept me awake. Now, they were impossible to ignore. I knew something, or someone, was trying to communicate, but whatever it was, remained in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment. During the day, I tried to focus on my studies, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I sat down to study, the image of the half-open closet door crept back into my thoughts. The physical discomfort of being in the room also began to increase. Sometimes, while I was writing or reading, I'd feel a chill down my spine, as if the air around me was being watched by an invisible presence. Each night, the sound of creaking grew louder, more disturbing. One night, while I tried to sleep, the noise became impossible to ignore. It was as if something was trying to get out of the closet, a slow, constant creaking of wood shifting against the floor. Fear overtook me, but something inside stopped me from getting up to check. I stayed under the covers, frozen, while the sound continued. Finally, it stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and I managed to fall asleep, but my rest was plagued with vague, disturbing dreams. The tension was consuming me, and I could no longer live normally in the room. Even with the closet door closed, it felt like something was about to escape. I knew the mystery was pulling me into something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. The strangest part was that as terrified as I was, a part of me still wanted to know the truth. What had started as simple curiosity had now turned into a silent obsession, and I couldn't stop thinking about what that closet held. In the days that followed, I started noticing the people around me seemed different too. Conversations were muted, and eyes avoided mine. My dorm mates no longer asked how I was, as if they already knew something was wrong but preferred not to get involved. The constant discomfort, the sleepless nights, and the feeling of being watched were starting to wear on my sanity. I needed answers, but every time I got closer to them, the fear became unbearable. I tried to ignore the events. I tried convincing myself they were just coincidences, that the sounds, the sensations, and the locked closet were products of my imagination. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the quiet fear followed me at every moment. During the nights, the noises from the closet continued, louder and closer each time. It felt like with each passing night, whatever was hidden inside was gaining more strength, more life. The door, sometimes slightly open, sometimes shut, always seemed different from how I'd left it. The nights became endless. Even with the lights on, the feeling that something was lurking inside the closet didn't go away. The sound of something moving, almost like someone dragging their feet across the floor, sent chills down my spine. I knew I couldn't pretend this was normal any longer. The mystery had taken over my life, and the fear consumed me so deeply that I could barely leave the room without looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me. The scariest part was that the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. One day, after returning from campus, I found the closet door open again. My heart raced the moment I realized something was off. The door, which I had locked before leaving, was now slightly ajar, as if someone had stepped out of it. I walked toward it with hesitant steps, my breath caught in my throat. The inside of the closet seemed darker than usual, as if the darkness itself was something solid, dense, almost alive. My entire body trembled as I looked inside, but there was nothing. At least, nothing I could see. I closed the door as quickly as I could and returned to my bed, trying to catch my breath. Fear overwhelmed me, but now it was something different. It was more intense, more personal, as if something was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The closet was no longer just a physical space. It was a portal to something I couldn't understand, something that was now very close to crossing over into my world. The tension grew with each passing day, and the quiet fear that had followed me was now beginning to affect my sanity. I couldn't tell what was real anymore and what was a product of my mind. Was it just the closet? Or was there something else in the room? Something invisible, moving through the shadows, waiting for the right moment to appear? That night, a storm took over the city. Lightning lit up the sky, and the sound of rain pounding against the windows filled the room with a sense of impending dread. I tried to focus on anything other than the closet, but my mind was fixated on it, as if I knew something was about to happen. I tried to close my eyes and sleep, but soon I was startled awake by a sound that froze me to my core. The closet door opened on its own, with a slow, torturous creak. I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel the presence, dense, suffocating, filling the room with a heavy, malevolent energy. My body was paralyzed with fear, and for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. The darkness seemed to shift, alive, as if it were waiting for the right moment to fully engulf me. The lightning flashes briefly lit the room, but darkness quickly reclaimed it, deep and impenetrable. With my heart pounding, I forced myself to look toward the closet. That's when I saw a figure standing in the shadows, indistinct but undeniably present. A human-like shadow, but faceless, without identity. The figure seemed to be made of darkness, a mass that shifted in the air, watching me silently. I knew it wasn't a living being, but a presence that had inhabited that room for a long time. Perhaps it was the same person who once occupied the space, someone who had never truly left. I tried to turn on the light, but my fingers were shaking so much that it took forever to find the switch. When the light finally came on, the figure was gone. However, the closet door was now completely open, wide and revealing what I had tried so hard to ignore for so long. There was nothing inside, and yet there was everything. The emptiness in the closet seemed to stretch into something beyond what my eyes could see. It was a space that didn't belong to this world. I stood up, trembling, unable to bear the weight of the terror. I closed the closet door, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The mystery had revealed itself in a way I never expected. The figure, the presence, the anonymous warning. Everything was part of something bigger, something I would never fully understand. The closet held more secrets than anyone could imagine, and now I was marked by it. No matter where I went, the fear and the mystery of that locked door would follow me forever.